1984 is a warning of the future. Orwell is trying to warn us about the structure and priorities of the government. The government in 1984 has a whole department for torture and false interrogations. This is a topic that has a lot of history, and Orwell knew it could lead to many horrible things, thus warning us of the consequences of this in 1984. In 1984, the Ministry of Love is in charge of maintaining order. They did this by using brutal techniques that nobody else except for them knew about completely. At the end of the book, however, Winston is interrogated and brainwashed by them. They would threaten him until he confessed that he was guilty and that he was delusional for thinking otherwise. They made him believe himself to be wrong about everything he ever knew. This happens sometimes in the real world to force confessions on suspects who have not been charged yet. In 1934, Raymond Stewart was murdered. 3 black men were arrested for this crime. 2 officers came to the house of one of them and brutally beat him, hung him by his neck, and whipped him to force a false confession. After the trial, they repeated the whipping while they were driving him to jail until he confessed. After he confessed, he was brought to jail. The 2 other men were also taken to jail where they were whipped until they confessed to the crime. They made his confession the exact details that the group wanted, and the men said if they changed their stories, they would be hurt harder. This aligns with 1984 in many ways. The brutality of the torture as well as the forced bending of the truth makes it clear that Orwell wrote this story as a way to show that corrupt governments control the truth of trials and the justice system can be used to falsely imprison and hide dissenters. On May 6, 1993, 3 boys were found dead in a creek, tied and mutilated. Jesse Misskelley, along with 2 other boys, were suspects on the trial. Misskelley had an IQ of 72, which made him borderline intellectually functional. The interrogation of Misskelley was cited by experts as a prime example of police coercion. The officers convinced him into giving a confession, and Misskelley says he was scared of the officers during the interrogation. His father never said he could be interrogated, and was only told he was in custody. This can be connected to 1984 and that the Ministry of Love takes advantage of the less intelligent, the proles, to force confessions out of them. In the case of the Norfolk 4 Navy veterans Joseph J. Dick Jr., Derek Tice, Daniel Williams, and Eric C. Wilson were wrongly convicted in the 1997 rape and murder of Michelle Moore Bosco in Norfolk, Virginia. Each was subjected to high-pressure interrogation tactics, including threats of death penalty and questionable use of lie detector tests. The details of the confessions did not match the crime scene, the other confessions, or the confession of the real killer, Omar Ballard, who testified that he acted alone. The Norfolk 4 defendants spent nearly 4 decades in prison collectively for crimes they did not commit, another collective 30 years after release from prison under highly restricted parole, and sex offender registry conditions that imposed barriers to their re-entry into society. This is yet another example of the ways that some officers used to force confessions out of suspects. They threatened death, like in 1984, where they threatened Winston with a cage of rats above his head. They made him believe that he actually did it. At the end of the novel, Winston says that he actually loves Big Brother, despite spending his whole life questioning it. In September of 2008, 26-year-old Adrian Thomas rushed his 4-month son, Matthew, to a hospital in Troy, New York after the child became unresponsive. Matthew was pronounced brain dead, and the doctor initially suspected a head injury. When police questioned Adrian at first, Adrian denied doing anything wrong. But after being interrogated for 10 straight hours, he finally gave a videotaped confession in which he admitted throwing Matthew on the bed in frustration. Adrian was charged with second-degree murder. At trial, Adrian's defense team maintained that his confession was coerced through a controversial method known as the Reed technique, which uses psychological manipulation to extract a confession from a subject. During his interrogation, Adrian was inexplicably told that a confession could save Matthew's life, and that his wife would take the fall for the crime if he didn't admit to it. Further medical examination found no evidence that Matthew had suffered a skull fracture. In fact, the doctor who initially reported a head injury came to believe that Matthew's death was actually caused by sepsis, a blood infection. Nevertheless, Adrian's videotaped confession proved strong enough to secure a guilty verdict and a sentence of 25 years to life. In 2012, Adrian's case caught the attention of Blue Hatayeg and Grover Babcock, filmmakers who chronicled the story in The Scenes of a Crime, a documentary about false confessions. Eventually, the case went to the New York Court of Appeals. They concluded that Adrian's interrogation went too far and that his confession never should have been allowed in court. His conviction was overturned, and the confession was not presented as evidence at his second trial. Adrian Thomas was finally acquitted on June 12th of 2014. So how, in the real world, do we prevent this? There are many codes police must follow while interrogating suspects. If police are found to violate these, the evidence must be omitted from the trial and cannot be used against the suspect. Recorded interrogations help verify the integrity of the interrogation, and when used, immensely protect the rights of the accused. The Miranda law states that suspects must be informed of their rights before being taken into custody, and this is required for law enforcement of the United States.